So my name is Tina Werkmann. I'm a co-chair of Labour Against the Witchhunt, and I'm chairing this second session. The first session was absolutely brilliant. Speakers, you have your work cut out to do as well as the second session, the first session. This session, though, is also really, really important. We want to examine how the so-called definition of anti-Semitism published by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance is neither a definition nor does it deal much with anti-Semitism. It is designed, particularly in its 11 examples, to delegitimize criticism of Israel and anti-Zionism. And it's an integral and important part of the international campaign against pro-Palestinian and left voices. And the attempt to criminalize the boycott, divestment and sanction movement in Germany, France, Britain, the USA, etc., is very much part of this attempt to shut down anybody who speaks up on this issue. In Britain, it often felt as this was just directed against Jeremy Corbyn and to get rid of him, but it goes much, much further than that. This is really spreading rapidly into all areas of society and in different countries, and including universities, which we'll examine later in the sessions, but also schools. Coming from Germany, I grew up in a period where socialists and communists were not allowed to work as teachers or be part of any other government department. It was a sackable offense, and plenty of teachers were sacked. We're very much heading into a very similar direction. In Britain, for example, it is not allowed, teachers are not allowed to use so-called anti-capitalist materials in class. The government is planning on stopping demonstrations and protests outside venues of national infrastructure, which includes the so-called infrastructure, which includes printing presses, because of course of the excellent blockade by Extinction Rebellion recently. This will all get worse. It will get much, much worse internationally if we do not stand up to it. And this is what this meeting really is about. How can we internationally stand up against this campaign to shut us up? It's an international campaign which we must fight against internationally. So we're really, really happy to welcome so many people from all over the world in this session. And isn't it nice how Zoom allows us to do this? The first speaker to this afternoon will be Tony Greenstein, who almost needs no introduction. He's a lifelong anti-racist campaigner, like many of our speakers. He has a Jewish background. His blog is world famous because he's certainly not holding back on either exposing Zionists or right-wingers, or of the amount of pictures and graphic he's using in his blog. He will be speaking briefly, well, for 10 minutes on the, chiefly on the IHRA misdefinition on anti-Semitism. Thank you, Tony.
Right, thank you, comrades. Welcome to everyone. The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition is the main instrument for clamping down on free speech. And you will probably know that it says that if you compare Israel to Nazi Germany or the Holocaust, then that is almost certainly anti-Semitic. So the first thing about it is that the IHRA is itself named after the Holocaust, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. And the question is, where did it come from? It was first adopted by the European Union Monitoring Committee in 2005, but it was actually predated that. At a conference of what was then called the Working Definition of Anti-Semitism in Paris in 2011, at a conference which was sponsored by the World Zionist Organization, the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the Ministry of Diaspora Affairs, amongst other organizations. Kenneth Stern, the principal drafter of the definition, said, and I quote, "The idea for a common definition was, as far as I know, first articulated by Dina Porat. Dina Porat is the chief historian at Yad Vashem, the Israeli Holocaust Propaganda Museum in Jerusalem, a museum which is situated almost adjacent to Di Yassin, the first horrific massacre in the Nakba. And it was designed principally to trap criticism of Israel and Zionism and label it as anti-Semitic. It was based on the idea that people criticized Israel, not because of what it did, but because it was a Jewish state. And if you employ that logic and you think about it, Northern Ireland, Ulster, called itself a Protestant state, a Protestant supremacist state. Does anyone buy the idea that if people criticised what was in effect a loyalist police state for 50 years, that they were doing that because it was run by Protestants? Or give another example, South Africa, which called itself a white Christian state. Does anyone really believe that people opposed apartheid because it was white? We had a hang up because some people were white as opposed to black? No, of course not. It was the practices of apartheid itself that were the target. And the question I always ask is, why do you need a definition of anti-Semitism other than, say, in a dictionary? The Oxford English Dictionary defines anti-Semitism in 6 words: hostility to or prejudice against Jews. The IHRA is over 500 words, which really is not a definition by definition. For example, my father and many other thousands of Jews took part in the Battle of Cable Street in 1936 to stop the fascists marching through the East End. Did they need a definition of anti-Semitism to know what it was about? To know what anti-Semitism was? Of course not. It was self-evident. So again, the question is, why the IHRA? And the clear reason is to protect the state of Israel. If you term the Israeli state a racist state, then or a racist endeavor, to use its curious formulation, then you are deemed to be anti-Semitic. Well, given that Israel is racist, a racist state, a racist ethno-nationalist state, what that in essence is saying is that there is a basis to anti-Semitism being true, that you can say something which is true, but it can still be anti-Semitic. In other words, that racism has a valid basis, and that is the logic of Zionism itself. Let's be quite clear. Israel is inherently racist because it defines itself as a Jewish state, or in the words of Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel is a state not of all its citizens, but its Jewish citizens. And there's a very clear example which goes to the heart of what Israel is about. Under the law return, the most basic law in Israel, I, as someone who is Jewish, have an automatic right to return to Israel, even if I have never been there, whereas Palestinians who live there, who were born there, whose families lived there for generations, they have no such right. And that is racist, if anything is racist. If racism has any meaning at all, then clearly if you don't have the right to live in the land in which you were born, yet strangers, settlers from other countries come there, that has to be racist. The thing about the IHRA, which is quite curious in a way, is that people who are genuinely anti-Semitic have no problem with it. Donald Trump, when he was attacking 4 black congresswomen and telling them to go back to where they came from, although 3 of them were born in the United States, he also added for good measure that they were anti-Semitic. Why? Because they criticized the Israeli state. Or take another example, Viktor Orban, who won the 2018 election in Hungary on an explicitly anti-Semitic platform, attacking George Soros as a global financier. Hungary too has adopted the IHRA, and one can run through the list of people on the far right who are more than happy with the IHRA. In fact, the irony is, in the German Bundestag, which declared that BDS, boycott, divestment and sanctions, was anti-Semitic, the most vociferous opponents of BDS were the neo-Nazi Alternative for Germany, AfD. And it is an irony when people who are explicitly anti-Semitic, who have neo-Nazis amongst their ranks, are nonetheless foremost advocates of implementing the IHRA. And that is the reality of the situation we have today, that the IHRA is a weapon in the hands of the ruling class. It's not an anti-racist weapon in any sense, shape or form. And it's no accident that Kenneth Stern, its principal drafter, who is an American academic, has come out strongly against what he terms is the weaponization of the IHRA. But if in the Labour Party you were to say that the IHRA, which has been adopted, has been weaponized, that is grounds for your suspension and expulsion. And I have to say that Jeremy Corbyn in 2016, who adopted the 38-word definition of the IHRA without any compulsion whatsoever, in essence, made a rod for his own back, and also for everyone else in the Labour Party as well. If instead of appeasing, he had actually come out at the very beginning against the weaponization of anti-Semitism, he might now be in number 10 instead of Boris Johnson. But that maybe is another story. What is the IHRA based on? People say, and it was certainly said in Brighton when the Brighton Hove Council adopted it, that the IHRA is the product of the wishes of the Jewish community, that you are attacking the identity of a Jewish community, the majority of whom consider themselves Zionists and supporters of Israel. And that is to an extent true. The majority Jewish identity today is pro-Zionist and pro-Israel. And all I have to say to that is that attacking or criticizing an identity is not the same as criticizing the existence of a people. An identity is a political and cultural formation. And if you criticize an identity, there's nothing at all racist about that. For example, I mean, I supported Salman Rushdie's satanic verses. Many Muslims oppose that as being an attack on their identity. Was it racist to support Salman Rushdie? I very much doubt it. Let's give you another example. Imagine that in Britain, there had been 100,000 expatriate white South Africans who said that apartheid was part of their identity. Would it have been racist to criticize apartheid? No, of course not. Apartheid was a political and ideological system. It wasn't something which was inherent in being white or being indeed white South African. So I think we do have to be clear about what we are facing. And in the Labour Party, I mean, I find it amusing that David Evans says that the reason for banning free speech is because it makes Jews feel unsafe. Well, that is a form of othering people who are Jewish. Of course, he's only referring to certain Jews, but I find that in itself anti-Semitic. But I come back to the IHRA itself, because it's based on the idea that Israel is the inheritor of the mantle of the Holocaust. And when someone like, for instance, Ken Livingstone spoke out of turn and reminded us of the record of Zionism during the Holocaust, then he was immediately shot down and called the Nazi apologist by, amongst others, John Mann, if you remember. The same John Mann who produced a booklet which described gypsies as a social problem of antisocial behavior. And I would just like to quote from Burl Katznelson, who was the deputy to David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel. And he wrote this. He was a founder of Mapai, the Israeli Labour Party. And he said, in the 30s, he said, the rise of Hitler was an opportunity to build and flourish like none we have ever had or will have. And Ben-Gurion himself said, the Nazis' victory would become a fertile force for Zionism. We don't hear these quotes today. We don't hear these ideas. But in the 1930s, the Zionist leadership saw the rise of Hitler as an opportunity, not as something that foretold great horrors for the Jewish people. And so whilst vast majority of Jews supported a boycott of Nazi Germany, the Zionist movement en masse opposed it. And the reason why was quite simple. Their concentration was on building a racial state, an ethno-nationalist state. And although today it's said that if you compare Israel to Nazi Germany, you're anti-Semitic, the fact is that Holocaust survivors like Zev Sternhall, a professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, have warned that Israel today is very similar to what Germany was between 1933 and 39. For example, that Jews were only able to live in certain parts of German cities, just as today in Israel itself, Palestinian citizens cannot live in hundreds of Jewish communities. And there is a law, the Reception Committee's law, the Admission Committee law of 2011, which gives Jewish communities the right to bar access to Palestinians and stop them being members. So we should be under no doubt. Israel is a racist state, and the IHRA is devised with one purpose and one purpose alone. It is not to stop or to prevent anti-Semitism, but it is to ensure that the Israeli state wards off criticism. And the reason why it's been adopted by the British and the American establishment is because Israel is at the center of British and American and Western imperialist foreign policy in the Middle East. So I'll leave it at that, but just to say, we have to take up the IHRA because it is a dire threat to our freedom of speech in this country and abroad. Thank you.
Quite right. Thank you very much, Tony. I noticed you didn't leave any breathing space between your sentences, so I couldn't actually get in to wind you up.
I am
But
extremely sorry for that.
You've done very well. Thank you. 12 minutes. And it was very thought-provoking, I thought. Kevin Bean will be the next speaker. He is going to focus on the universities. He's a lecturer, or former lecturer, member of the UCU, University College Union. And he's also part of a quarter of the Wavertree Four, who've all been suspended recently for criticizing their MP, and he's actually been expelled since then as well. So solidarity, Kevin.
Okay, thank you, Tina. Yes, I am a member of the University of Liverpool University and Colleges Union branch. I am speaking in a personal capacity, but I'm sure that what I'm about to say will be supported by many members of my union and indeed by many people who work in British universities. Earlier this year, well, in fact, just a few months ago, the Secretary of State for Education, Gavin Williamson, wrote to the Vice Chancellors of British universities, effectively the heads of the universities, and urged them to adopt the IHRA definition as a working definition of anti-Semitism. And in doing this, he also put forward an implied threat that if universities didn't adopt the definition, then this may well lead to their funding being cut, and perhaps more importantly, that their rights to issue degrees and indeed act as universities could be threatened. He said as he did this, that there had been too many disturbing incidents of anti-Semitism on campus from both students and staff, and a lack of willingness by too many universities to confront this. He also went on to say that if I've not seen the overwhelming majority of institutions adopting the definition by Christmas, then I will act. Well, it's very close to Christmas, and we will see what sort of action he takes. In urging this, he was, of course, joined and supported by the Secretary of State for Education, the Shadow Secretary of State for Education, Kate Green, one of Keir Starmer's recent appointees. And she also urged universities to adopt the IHRA definition. Now, if we look at the adoption of the definition, statistics are, I think, hard to come by at the moment. Universities, like other institutions, are working under some restrictions. But it would seem that out of the 133 universities in Britain, that about 29 or so have adopted the IHRA definition. Many of them are leading universities. They're the most prestigious. They include the University of Cambridge, and a number of other leading universities who've adopted this in some form. I could run through the list, including my own: Liverpool, Newcastle, Nottingham, University College London, Durham, Edinburgh, Manchester, and so on. Now, what's quite important about the adoption of the definition is that it's usually carried out by the senior management of the university. I won't bore the meeting with talking about the arcane features of university management, but in many universities there are still democratic, or at least pseudo-democratic senates and other bodies which are supposed to represent the university at large. And many of these bodies were not consulted. And in most cases, the adoption was just carried out by a senior management team. The other point about the adoption is that it's largely been carried out, I think, in the last year, certainly to the last year, 18 months or so. So it's quite probable that in many universities, this has not gone through the usual channels. It's been adopted during, I think, a fairly different period when the normal debate isn't around. However, that shouldn't, I think, play down the importance of this issue, or indeed the potential opposition to this issue. My union has had a long record of opposing the IHRA definition. It's passed motions to that effect. And just recently, the National Executive wrote to Gavin Williamson to oppose the statement. And indeed, in a number of branches where the definition has recently been adopted, the branches have spoken out against it, and indeed are now campaigning against it. So as an issue, free speech on Palestine, and indeed this wider issue, has been quite an important one in our union. At the beginning, Tina referred to the Berufsverbot in West Germany in the post-war period. And we've not had anything of that type, but it's certainly now becoming more of an issue about what one can or can't say in a university, particularly because the measures or the definition is, I think, sufficiently vague to really encompass quite a wide range of statements and arguments. So it's an issue that probably is going to build in the union. As I said, we've had quite heated debates over our opposition to this statement before, and indeed on issues of the boycott and the disinvestment campaign. So, we are not strangers to this, and in many ways, I think we will perhaps be in the front line because of the intellectual dimension of shutting down debate. I see the role of the universities in this as part of a much wider international issue. And again, both Tony and Tina in their opening remarks referred to events in the United States and the events in Germany. Recently, the American Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, organized an international conference on anti-Semitism. And he had a number of invited speakers, the Secretary of State for the Duchy of Lancaster, Michael Gove, John Mann, who we've already come across, and Luciana Berger, the former Labour MP for Wavertree, which is where I was a member of the Labour Party. Now, what was significant in that discussion about anti-Semitism was this wider argument that anti-Semitism was clearly linked to anti-imperialism and indeed to anti-capitalism. And the argument was that this growing tide of anti-Semitism, or this alleged tide of anti-Semitism, was fueled by militant anti-capitalism that identified Jews with capitalism. And it repeated this idea that any opposition to Israel, or indeed any opposition to the United States policies, was anti-capitalist and was, in effect, anti-Semitic. Now, I see the adoption of this definition as part of a much wider current, which is trying to delegitimize all forms of opposition to American policy, to the particular policies of Israel in the Middle East, but perhaps more importantly, to all forms of challenge to the status quo. It is, as I said earlier when introducing the draft charter, but what I think is increasingly happening is that what is possible to debate, what is possible to talk about is now being narrowly restricted. And the earlier references to the PREVENT programme, the definition of extremism, the definition of political violence, and indeed the whole idea of what is an acceptable set of political ideas is, I think, really implicit in this, attempt to get this definition more widely accepted in universities. Tony referred to Kenneth Stern and his role in the drafting of the definition. But Stern also made the point, he said that it was never intended as a campus hate speech code. And indeed, the use of this definition in a sort of quasi-judicial role inside universities does, I think, have many dangers for us. So why do I think that it's of much wider importance? Well, I think, first of all, that it has a symbolic value. Because its adoption is relatively new in Britain, and it doesn't have, as far as we can see at the moment, a definite legal status, then how it will be used against individuals still remains unclear. So it means that if, for example, a member of staff or a student is deemed to have contravened this definition, whether this is then actionable in terms of bringing the university into disrepute or justifying any other form of disciplinary action, I think is still open to question. But I think the danger, of course, is self-censorship of a growth of a sort of a climate of fear, which prevents people from speaking out, not only on the obvious issues of Middle Eastern politics, Israel and Palestine, the United States and so on, but in the much wider context. So I think it's establishing that type of framework, establishing that type of climate that actually makes it so significant in that way. The other issue, I think, is the idea that the universities are significant ideological battlegrounds. Universities in Britain are very important institutions. Something like 50% of the relevant age group of young people now attend an institution called a university. They're very powerful, they're very important. So as a battleground for shaping opinion, as a battleground for shaping how future generations, and indeed the wider public and intellectual culture functions, they are very significant places. It's very tempting, I think, for people who think of universities as ivory towers, or think that this is all something of a storm in a teacup, to dismiss that. But I think they're quite central. And why they're central is, of course, that the battle of ideas, the battle for public opinion, often begins in universities. So if you can freeze the debate, if you can shut out sections of opinion, then you've done a very, very good service to your cause. And I think that this is clearly what is behind this. But I think there's also a moral dimension as well. And I think Tony alluded to it, and many of the sessions alluded to it this morning, which is that this delegitimization of certain political positions is not just saying that you're wrong, it's actually saying that you're morally wrong. And I think wrapping yourself in the cover of this definition, of even arguing that to oppose the definition somehow equates you with anti-Semitism, and then links you to one of the most horrendous incidents in world history in the past 100 years, again, does this attempt to delegitimize and to undermine you. And the fact that this has been taken up by the British Conservatives and by the Labour right shows exactly where that type of delegitimization is coming from. So, comrades, this is an important area. My union, both locally and nationally, will take the issue up. We will begin the fight back, and we will, of course, work with other comrades and other supporters of free speech and democracy to ensure that this attempt to close down the debate is defeated. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Kevin. Excellent contribution. Our next speaker is Leah Levane. She's co-chair of Jewish Voice for Labour. She's with us in a personal capacity. She's also a Labour Party councillor in Hastings, and as I understand it, not yet suspended. Congratulations.
Thank you. I don't know how I've managed that. So thanks everyone for inviting me. I've been thinking broadly about the free speech issues, and I put some things in chat that people suggested I raise. So I think most of that needs to be addressed, that my concerns about calling for free speech, perhaps rather than speaking truth to power, might be things better addressed when time is so short today at the conference on the 23rd. So this session's about the IHRA. As Tony indicated, emotionally now has a connection by being under the auspices of the Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. It has a particular resonance that people who don't know the ins and outs of it find particularly hard to resist, in addition to the people who are manipulating it quite consciously. So I don't need to go into some of the problems. It's clearly not useful in dealing with anti-Semitism. And there is a really long list of people who oppose this definition and the way the working definition has been used, as people have said, starting with the author himself. Others include many Jewish academics, lawyers, including Israeli Jews, who are all appalled at the weaponization of anti-Semitism, which is important and real, and of course the conflation of criticism of Israel and all the ideology and of course the reality of Zionism with anti-Semitism. So I think in the very left-wing journal, The Times of Israel, irony alert, there was a blog yesterday or the day before listing, if you look up who's against the IHRA, this will come up in your Google search, and there is an enormous list. There are links to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people from all sorts of walks of life. Jewish Voice for Labour, if you go onto our website, we have a plethora of articles and links to erudite dismantling of the definition, much as Tony has outlined it, the definition that's not a definition. But facts and learned opinion seem to matter far less than the distortion that's become an accepted truth that this is the internationally recognized definition. It is not. And this way in which distortions and lies have been accepted as truths is the biggest danger. And we may go back to the definition. Why does even the mild caveat in the definition, in the working definition, get so frequently ignored? That the 11 examples, 7 of which are about Israel, are all referred to as may, given the context, be anti-Semitic. May, given the context. We never hear about the context. It's never quoted. It's never referred to, except when we make the sort of arguments we're making here today as an excuse by those who advocate it of proof that it's not about conflating Israel and anti-Semitism, that it doesn't close down speech about Palestine. Now, the pressure to adopt the IHRA working definition has been and continues to be intense in the extreme. So this very day, by being here, I'm under some scrutiny. There was an article in a local blog. I was asked to comment and I chose not to. And it's very interesting to see what they say. I might put up on the chat later. So I am frankly wondering when the email will arrive from the Labour Party General Secretary telling me that I'm being investigated or suspended for speaking against Labour Party policy, especially because I'm a local councillor. Now, just give an example. I could state categorically that I 100% disagree with current Labour Party policy about retaining a commitment to nuclear weapons. But I do not think that if I spoke on a platform with CND urging a change in that policy, that I'd be looking over my shoulder in the same way or at all. And it's ludicrous that so many have been investigated, suspended, or even expelled, including many Jewish comrades, for allegations of anti-Semitism. And it's worrying, especially in the context of a free speech conference, that I should feel concerned about expulsion, suspension, investigation for speaking the truth, or even for just having a different opinion and perspective, even when I have not broken any of the Labour Party's rules. There's nothing in the rule book that says I can't speak against main policy. There's nothing in the rule book that says I must not speak on a platform with people who have been expelled. Nonetheless, I am not operating in accordance with Pledge 5 of the 10 that the Board of Deputies of British Jews insisted that the leadership candidates signed up to. These pledges have not yet, and hopefully never will be, turned into Labour Party rules. So my own council, which has recently adopted this working definition with additional clauses to protect the right to free speech on Israel and for groups to be able to campaign against human rights abuses on our streets. Both Jewish Voice for Labour and the Palestine Solidarity Campaign were explicitly mentioned by the proposer of the motion as reasons for the town being known as a place that welcomes anti-Semites. That is such an insult to the town of Hastings, and a ludicrous distortion of what's happening. And as Kevin has outlined, I don't need to go into details again, as much force is being now applied to universities with threats of withdrawal or reduction of funding and even the ability to award fees. I'm going to try and, yeah. So the point is that we get told, well, let's just adopt it because there's more important issues at stake. How can we let our students down? How can we let the local people in our town down? And these are really important things that people are grappling with, and they are real. But how far in has that thin end of the wedge already been pushed? And how much more will it be pushed in if we fail to raise our concerns, not only about what is happening in Palestine, but about what's happening to our ability to speak truth to power? And I will say on the record that Israel is an apartheid state. Desmond Tutu said this many years ago, and he should know. And if there was any doubt, the recent nation-state law explicitly confirms that there are people's rights, that their people's rights and status will differ depending on which community you belong to. And that is before we consider the millions of Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank and East Jerusalem who have no say over the Israeli national government, but this is a government that actually controls every aspect of their lives, let alone the millions of descendants that Tony has talked about, the original refugees who cannot return. And yet, in theory, like Tony, I have the right to settle. I don't think they want me very much, but that's technically I have the right. And I won't go into, because some people have already referred to the boycott, divestment and sanctions and what's happening in Germany, France, and indeed similar laws are being proposed, or at least seriously considered in this country. I'm sure that Ronnie Barkan will particularly address that. But there are other problems with this dominance of the debate about the IHRA, this whole campaign. So I just want to talk a little bit today about racism towards Black and Asian and Muslim people. The issue of Labour Party anti-Semitism and the necessity of adopting the IHRA working definition has dominated the airwaves and the mainstream media in all its forms. Of course, issues such as Windrush and the hostile environment are mentioned, but never with the force, the frequency, or even the levels of criticism of the government that have been applied around this issue in relation to the Labour Party. It's a bit ironic, even carrying on under Starmer. And by the way, Starmer is supposed to be such a great leader, such a great manager, and managerialism is the best he seems to be offering, that he set as a benchmark for success in tearing out anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, that people like Louise Ellman would come back to the party. Not something he's got any control over. So failed management 101. But one of the things he did do was to commission Doreen Lawrence to look into the reasons behind the disproportionate impact of COVID on Black and Asian communities. And this report, if any of you even heard about it, was published less than 48 hours before the IHRA report into the handling of complaints of anti-Semitism by the Labour Party. Wasn't an investigation into anti-Semitism. The final chapter of the Lawrence report is about dealing with systemic racism. Again, who remembers this report? Who's writing about it? Who's reading about it? Who's acting on its recommendations? And 13 days after the publication of that IHRA report, a cross-party parliamentary committee, again, not your mad lefties, chaired by Harriet Harman, and dominated by conservatives numerically, reported about racism.
Start speaking after.
Sorry, I've nearly finished. Sorry, Ronnie. Anyway, this report about racism and human rights ended with the stark conclusion: Black people's human rights are not protected in the United Kingdom. As far as I'm concerned, this ought to be headline news and run until this is sorted. By the way, it also considered the HRC unfit for purpose. But it's not. We're not hearing about this report. We are still hearing about Labour anti-Semitism. And so on. So I'm sorry, I will come to that, but there is fight back. That's what I wanted to say. So today is part of the fight back, developing campaigns about free speech, taking on board some of the caveats that we will need to. The Palestinian solidarity movement, I think, is growing and not weakening, and certainly sympathy for Palestinians is not waning. Raising awareness about Palestinians' lived experience is more important than ever, as Israel has, for example, ramped up the amount of demolitions in the West Bank and East Jerusalem during this pandemic, and children continue to get arrested in the middle of the night, and Palestinians continue to get injured and killed by Israeli soldiers and settlers, who then receive light, if any, punishment. And more young people, including more young Jews, are standing up for Palestinians, and connections are being made between the Black Lives Matter movement and the Palestinian solidarity movement. And this is really terrifying for the ruling class. Jews from across the world are gathering together to oppose the use of the IHRA. I've been involved in meetings with people from at least 14 countries, from North and South America, many European countries, and Australia and New Zealand. And our first act has been to issue a statement in support of that recent statement issued by Palestinian Arab academics, journalists, and intellectuals. And we're working on our next actions. I'm sure I'm coming towards the end of my time. Obviously, the fight back that Kevin has outlined from the University Colleges Union. Jewish Voice for Labour's slogan is always with the oppressed and not the oppressor. It relates to things that were said in the morning or the earlier session. Never again has got to be never again for anybody. So that is our slogan is a direct quote from Marek Edelman. We take no credit for it. We always want to credit him. Marek Edelman, for those of you who don't know, was a heroic leader of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising and a man who refused to emigrate to Israel, but rather wanted to work to make Poland and the rest of the world safe for Jews and other people who are oppressed. We shall not give up the fight. I hope you will join us. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you, Leah. Thank you very much. Excellent speech. Comrades, I've put in the article that Leah referred to from the Times of Israel, and we actually have a speaker later in the session, hello Rowan, from that organization that compiled this excellent article. So that's definitely worthwhile to later. Before I bring in Ronnie Kasrils, though, we have actually Sami Ramadani, who will speak first, if that's okay, Ronnie, because we want to concentrate and then we get to the international section. We've spotted Sami in the audience and thought we can't just, let him be in the audience. He needs to speak. So thank you very much for joining us. I think this is especially important in what Kevin has pointed out. This is not just about delegitimizing pro-Palestinian voices. This goes further. This is actually anti-imperialist voices, anti-war voices are now. This is laying the groundwork of silencing opposition to war, to forthcoming wars. And this is it's very important that the IHRA is being used for that as well. Sami is on the steering committee of the Stop the War Coalition in Britain, Iraq-born and a writer on Middle Eastern affairs. And I'm sure most of us know him. Thank you very much, Sami, for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tina, for inviting me. This morning's session was really inspiring. I was in awe of all the speakers and the points they made. And I was thinking, what else could I say and contribute? So I thought maybe I should just pick up on some of the points raised in this morning's session and try and comment on them and try and relate them to my own experience within the anti-war movement as an Iraqi born here in London. And I will pick initially on the point raised by Moshe Machover about the big lie, that there is a certain mechanism, there is a certain formula for spreading lies that capture the public's attention and public opinion. And this method is not unique to the way anti-Semitism has been weaponized, or the slander, the smear of anti-Semitism has been weaponized to silence the left and the wider left and anti-imperialist opinions. It's a well-practiced, well-rehearsed, historically famous method of trying to insinuate, spread lies through whatever media is available. And in the modern age, especially if we talk about Britain, then you're talking about the BBC and the leading, even some liberal outlets, how certain lies are propagated. And that reminded me very strongly of the accusations leveled against myself and nearly all people in the anti-war movement against Iraq in 2003. And the accusation was that if you are anti-war, then you are a supporter of Saddam's fascist regime. And that was a really abhorrent, hurtful accusation for most of Iraqis living here in Britain and abroad. That it's such a wicked accusation. And it was plainly to silence Iraqi voices, to shut them up, because Tony Blair and the United States and the war lobby were trying to say that the war is to the benefit of the Iraqi people, that the Iraqi people actually support this war of aggression, and that the Iraqi people are suffering under Saddam, therefore they will support the war. That was a big lie. And that big lie was actually quite successful in the United States, especially, but also in Britain. If it wasn't for that substantial minority, let's say, who supported the war, because the majority, I think, opposed the war, if it wasn't for that big lie, I think that war would have been defeated, at least within a British context. So spreading lies is a very powerful weapon that the right wing use to silence people, to drive them into fearing to express their opinion. I mean, it became a kind of a must that when I was introduced in any capacity in public forums, in the media, and so on, Sami is a refugee from Saddam's regime. So it became like an apology that if you are opposed to the war, you have to first show your ID that you have been against Saddam's regime, which is ridiculous because anti-war, anti-imperialist wars, anti-wars of aggression are points of principle. And if you hold on to that point of principle without having to constantly apologize, to appease, to try and show that you are a good boy or a good girl and so on, is really conceding defeat before you even start the fight. So the big fight today is to say, look, this smear of anti-Semitism is a big lie, and it has to be defeated as a lie because the target is not the anti-Semitic right wing or general anti-Semitic opinion and activists. The target is precisely those who are fighting anti-Semitism, fighting racism, fighting wars of aggression, and fighting for justice. Now, I think it was Kevin Bean who said that they are even equating anti-capitalism with anti-Semitism. And this is the wider context. What Pompeo did in his anti-Semitism conference fighting is very significant, that they do want to enlarge the umbrella. The ultimate aim is really to enlarge the umbrella so that they silence all Jewish anti-Zionist opinion, all Jewish non-Zionist opinion, all left-wingers who dare to support the Palestinian people, all Jews who dare to support the Palestinian people. So they use targets first, and once they succeed in describing such people as anti-Semitic, as racist, it's quite incredible that two of Britain's leading anti-racist campaigners like Jeremy Corbyn and Ken Livingstone, they have virtually succeeding in convincing millions of people that these are racist. It's the mind boggle as to the power of the media and the mechanism of perpetuating lies in the public mind. So Tony Greenstein, or whoever you want to pick, Moshe Machover, Chomsky, whoever you want to pick across the world, or Leah, or whoever, as long as they identify them as people of courage, people of principle, and isolate them and target them through lies, they hope to silence everybody. Fear. I'll give you an example, Tina, if I have the time. I'm a member of a kind of WhatsApp group of generally broadly in my own local community here, generally broadly left and so on. And somebody put an item saying, look, we have to raise our voices. All these left-wing Jews and so on are being silenced, and we have to say something about suspension of Jeremy Corbyn and so on. And somebody within minutes posted back, and she's a good fighter, principal. She said, look, we have to be all very careful. There might be some spies within our group who might get us suspended and all that. So obviously the element of fear, I'm sorry, I can't remember who raised that point earlier than me, but spreading fear, general fear, so that people are frightened, silenced. You are pro-Saddam, you are racist, you are anti-Semitic, and so on. It's terrifying, quite honestly. And a lot of people do tend to go silent in situations like that. So it's incumbent upon all of us to raise our voices, to say, look, the Jewish community, just like the Iraqi community here, are being used as the battering ram to sell war, to fight against good principled causes. Supporting the Palestinian people is a question of principle. It has zilch to do with being anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitism is a racist ideology that has to be fought tooth and nail. But there are just causes that we need to support. You can't fight anti-Semitism without supporting just causes across the world. This is a universal fight. So trying to explain that the Jewish community, just like the Iraqi or sometimes even Black communities, are used to as a battering ram to defeat just causes and principled people. So I say, let's fight back. And I think, I'm definitely sure we will win, even if it takes years. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Conrad. That was excellent. I think you put the nail on the head. Anti-Semitism is not the target. There's a minuscule number of real anti-Semitism cases in the labor movement, and they have been weaponized for exactly, as you say, to target those who are fighting anti-Semitism, target those who are standing up against war and imperialism, and that is the actual target. And they have been extremely, extremely successful. It's been incredible how successful it's been. But yes, we have to, it's very isolating and very, to target comrades individually and to suspend them and to say, you shan't stand on the same platform, which is actually how this campaign started off. We said, no, Jackie is expelled, Tony Greenstein has been expelled, Chris Williamson has been expelled, and we still invite them to our meetings. Of course we do. They have been unjustly expelled and suspended and targeted, and we will stand collectively against it, which is why it's quite important we're building an international campaign against these attempts. And we're very, very pleased and very happy now to welcome Ronnie Kasrils to our meeting.
Well, thanks for such an uplifting introduction. I mean, the whole meeting and the previous speakers, including the last one, have been so uplifting. And that's what we need to remind ourselves that, to use a hackneyed phrase, the force is with us. Forgive me for starting on a personal note, but the witch hunt you face in Britain and events I've been invited to address on Palestine in Europe and North America, which were banned, you've referred to Vienna. I think Ronnie Barkan and so many others have suffered such fates. But this takes me back 60 years ago to darkening days in apartheid South Africa. I was very young and had joined the movement. People were banned, so I was pushed to the fore to exercise my ability to speak. But very soon I was banned from public speaking, just months before full repression descended. We refused to submit, as is well known. We fought back, like so many others, through history. And through a united people struggle, reinforced by international solidarity, we toppled apartheid. So we empathize with British comrades facing this witch hunt. What is astonishing is that it is in the Labour Party, a one-time supporter of the anti-apartheid movement, that you're facing this intolerance. No doubt even the likes of Harold Wilson and Barbara Castle will be spinning in their graves. As the British Labour movement well knows, repressing freedom of speech in South Africa paved the way for wide-scale intimidation, brainwashing, outlawing opposition, and emergence of that terrorist state. The pattern of repression elsewhere. Apartheid's use of anti-communism as a blanket device, as with Joe McCarthy's witch hunting, is mirrored in manipulating anti-Semitism as a shield to protect Israel and shut us all up. It's an umbrella formula to delegitimize the Palestinian cause and, of course, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign. Upholding Palestinian rights has been reflected in so many United Nations resolutions, statements by Mandela, as well as Archbishop Tutu, and so many South Africans who have seen in Palestinian suffering far worse than our people experienced under apartheid. Apartheid alleged that the ANC struggle was about sweeping whites into the sea, which echoes the claim that giving in on Palestinian rights means extinction of Jewish people. Those on the left who link socialism and Palestinian solidarity articulate the very same message that we did in South Africa. The objective there was to change a system, not destroy a people. And as has been pointed out by everybody, criticizing Zionism, an exclusivist ethnic-based political doctrine, as Sami and others have said, is not anti-Semitic. It's the valid criticism of a reactionary political theory. We criticize Zionism, not the Jewish religion. We criticize Israel, not the Jewish people. The charges of anti-Semitism against Israel's critics are terms of Machiavellian elasticity being stretched by charlatans to stifle opposition. It's the new taboo the untouchable holy cow peddled in Western countries that hypocritically preach freedom of expression and democracy to the rest of the world. Those, and so many Jews, unfortunately, who fall prey, who are deceived by cynical deception, must take note of the lesson of the boy who cried wolf. When the real monster of anti-Semitism strikes, the most steadfast defenders of the victims have been on the left, as Tony pointed out. Remember Cable Street, and so much more. False allegations of anti-Semitism weaken the fight against the real demon. This is exactly the pitfall of the IHRA, the International Remembrance Association of the Holocaust, their treatise conflating criticism of Israel with hate speech. It is biased, totally flawed, devised by a handful of sophists seeking to be referee and player at the same time. In 1948, Menachem Begin visited New York to raise funds for his party, a party which later became Sharon and Netanyahu's Likud. No less than Einstein and Hannah Arendt labeled him a fascist. That same year, after cold-blooded massacres of Palestinians, an Israeli cabinet minister, Aharon Sisling by name, declared, "We have behaved like Nazis and my whole being is shaken." In terms of the Holocaust Association's guidelines, they would be labeled anti-Semitic. Corbyn's crime, that accusations of anti-Semitism within Labour Party have been exaggerated, are minuscule in comparison. Manufacturing mountains out of molehills, repeating the big lie characterizes the sophistry of medieval inquisitors, hitching Labour to the Blairite anti-socialist bandwagon. Unopposed, this witch hunt will escalate, attacking popular protest wherever humanity opposes injustice. This cannot be appeased, as comrades have been pointing out. It must be opposed and stopped, and it can be opposed by actions that are being expressed today. To use a glorious internationalist slogan, our clarion call must be, no passaran, they shall not pass. And we say to Starmer and his deputy Rayner, when they misappropriate that sacred trade union principle we've used and use in South Africa, an injury to one is an injury to all. In their denialism, they ignore the injury to millions of Palestinians facing the bullets and bombs of the Israeli war machine. I come to a close now by referring to the recent statement of prominent Palestinian and Arab figures with regard to the International Holocaust Association's false strictures. Attests to how the issue of anti-Semitism should be formulated. They declare that anti-Semitism must be debunked and combated in all forms. No expression of hatred for Jews should be tolerated anywhere in the world. And they issue the warning that diverting the necessary struggle against anti-Semitism to delegitimize the Palestinian cause and silence defenders of Palestinian rights, comrades like you, threatens to debase the struggle and hence to discredit and weaken it. So, comrades, the left and human rights movement, including Black Lives Matter, and formations such as the ANC in South Africa and so many other liberation movements around the world, in all the continents, look to them. We should join the Palestinian and Arab voices in formulating the guidelines on free speech and in combating the scourge of anti-Semitism and all forms of racism. Finally, I say to you, in your sterling work, comrades, and you're leading us, you're being heard in countries like South Africa. Many of the comrades here are tuning in to your meeting today. Consider those of these other continents, the ones who suffered from colonialism and settlement and repression from the empires, as the Palestinians do. Consider their formulation in your upcoming conference. While conditions for Palestinians might appear bleak, our support of the international community must never waver. Their fighting spirit prevails, and comrades, it strengthens struggles worldwide, including the witch hunt you face, as your struggles stimulate and support theirs. We experience that in our struggle in South Africa. We salute the resolve of the Palestinians, and we salute you, comrades. Thank you very much for having me along with you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, comrade. It was very heartwarming and inspiring. Thank you very much for joining us. Fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. Thank you. We're now coming to the other Ronnie, Ronnie Barkan, who is also a lifelong Jewish Israeli activist, co-founder of Boycott from Within. And he's been involved in protests against the Israeli barrier in the West Bank, has been arrested and detained a number of times. He lives in Berlin, is active in Berlin, as I understand it, where, of course, the parliament, the Bundestag, has declared the BDS movement anti-Semitic. So it'd be very interesting to hear your take on what's going on there. Hello, Ronnie.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I'm enjoying this event very much, so thank you all for participating. And I'll try to contribute as much as I can. I'd like to propose something very simple, basically, only 2 points today. But in order to make the case for these 2 points, maybe we will have to go into further details. So what are these 2 points? One is that the entire discourse claiming that anti-Zionism is somehow anti-Semitic, claiming the whole discourse basically leveling anti-Semitic accusations against the Labour Party and others is a false discourse. It is a made-up discourse, and this is based on the conflation of criminal supremacist Zionism with Judaism, and we have to reject it in its entirety. The other point is that this false discourse is extremely important in order to drive away the focus, the attention from what really matters. And what really matters is the struggle, I mean, whatever we do, about the struggle for equality, freedom, and justice in Palestine and throughout the world, or in other words, the struggle for the abolishment of supremacy, racism, and these institutes of supremacy and racism, including apartheid, fascism, and Zionism. Basically, everything that the Zionist project is about is that. It is a race state that from the get-go is built in order to oppress and subjugate basically one ethnic group at the expense, or basically for the benefit of the others. So in order to do that, I'd like to start off by, for example, I was presented here as being a Jewish activist and so on, and that is perfectly fine, but I'd like to question that terminology. You see, personally, if I have to self-identify, I don't regard myself as Jewish. I'm a human being, and that is more than enough for me. However, my legal status in that Zionist race state is of a privileged Israeli Jew. It is not a matter of my identification. It is the way that the state identifies me, legally identifies me as a privileged Israeli Jew. And that is because I have an Israeli citizenship, but I do not have an Israeli nationality because there is no such thing, for a very good reason. My nationality, according to the state, is Jewish. Now, my fellow citizens in Israel have other nationality, like Arab or Druze or Circassian. And this is the way that from the very beginning, from the very foundation of that Zionist race state, they were able to differentiate between the privileged group and the underprivileged and unwanted and undesired. Those that, first of all, they obviously expelled as many of those undesired by force, but since they haven't managed to complete the task, since they haven't managed to expel everyone, all Palestinians from their land, then they had to establish a system, a legal system included, in order to make sure that there will never ever be the possibility for equality between the privileged group like that I belong to and the others. So in order to do that, they have also, in the process, have also basically been using and abusing Judaism. So this is why my nationality is regarded as Jewish, and there is a whole set of laws stemming from 3 specific laws that were legislated in the early days of the Zionist state that differentiate between those with that Jewish nationality and others. And there are many, many more laws, over 50 of them today, that discriminate among Israeli citizens, discriminate between Israeli citizens based on that, based on whether one has Jewish nationality or other nationality. But we have to be very clear here. This has nothing to do with religion. It has everything to do with ethnicity. Saying that someone has Jewish nationality in Israel is exactly like saying that someone has a white status in apartheid South Africa. Both apartheid Israel and apartheid South Africa established apartheid in 1948. In the case of apartheid South Africa, it was much more kind of evident in your face. In the case of Israel, basically they established apartheid, I would say a more sophisticated form of apartheid based on a 2-tier system where on one level, all citizens of that state, after they managed to expel as many as possible, all the citizens of that state supposedly have the same rights based on their citizenship. But on top of that, and far more important, is the question of nationality. What type of nationality do they have? Citizens of the same state. And everything that the state of Israel does is to make sure that by law, and certainly things that are done in practice, are about privileging those of a certain nationality at the expense of all the others. So I would argue that we should, first of all, make the clear distinction between Zionism and Judaism. And more than that, I oppose any and all conflation between the two. There is precisely no connection whatsoever between Zionism and Judaism. More than that, anyone who makes that conflation is basically participating in Zionist propaganda. We obviously know that the Zionists, the representatives of the Zionist state say that if you're critical of that state, then you must also be somehow anti-Semitic. And we have to be very strict with the logic. When you say that criticism of Zionism and the Zionist project means that someone is somehow anti-Semitic, meaning anti-Jewish, it also means the logic of that statement also says the opposite. It also says that anyone who is Jewish, in the broad sense, it doesn't matter like by religion or otherwise, anyone who is Jewish must also be supportive of that criminal supremacist apartheid state. That is the most racist statement or the most anti-Semitic statement that one can make, that all Jews, because of their Jewishness, whatever that means, are inherently supportive of supremacy, apartheid, etc. So we have to be very strict with that. Now, when, unfortunately, it is not only happening, this conflation is not only happening from among those who are, let's say, Israeli representatives and so on, but actually we see this happening quite a lot, also within progressive media or liberal media and so on. I can refer to Peter Beinart's 7,000 Words of Zionist Propaganda in the Jewish, Jewish Currents, which some people hail as kind of some progress, which is somehow acknowledging Palestinian rights and so on, but actually it is all about that sinister conflation between criminal Zionism and Judaism, where Beinart claims that, for example, he urges the audience that we need to create a new Jewish identity. No, he doesn't mean a new Jewish identity, he means a new Zionist identity. And the question is there a Zionist identity that is separate from that supremacist nature? And I would argue that no, there is no such Zionist perception that accepts the rights of all the people. Now, this is the first point. The second point is that the discourse, that conflation that we have to reject in its totality, works in order to divert the attention and to focus on that rather than the things that matter. And I believe that the only approach that would benefit us in progressing the things that matter is to reject that false discourse in its totality. I don't think that we have to give much attention to it. That's on one hand, and also we have to reject it. So when we talk about the Labour and what happened with the Labour Party, I think that indeed Corbyn, for example, I think that he tried some sort of an apologetic discourse to take the apologetic approach in order to explain to people that actually these accusations are false and so on, rather than rejecting this whole notion as if criticism of the Zionist state is, or Zionism in general, is at all could be regarded as anti-Semitic. And the other thing that discourse does, especially when we accept it in such an apologetic tone, is also we accept basically the limiting of our ability to criticize. So they tell us, okay, it is okay to criticize the policies of the state of Israel, but not the very existence of that criminal apartheid state. And actually, the important part is not criticizing the policies, but actually criticizing the very nature, the very character of a race state that was built from the ground up to differentiate between people based on their racial or ethnic characteristics. Now, I didn't plan on talking about Yad Vashem, but since it was already mentioned, the Yad Vashem Museum, Holocaust Museum, as a museum, it is I think, worth visiting, and it is very educational. But however, it also serves another purpose, which is for Zionist propaganda. And I would like to give credit to attorney Itai Mak, who is basically diligently going after all kinds of exposing Israeli arms trade with the worst regimes around the world. And also, one of the things that he's challenging is the role of Yad Vashem for the sake of propaganda. And I'll just give you a quick list of those who have visited that museum in an official capacity, representing the states that they came from. And this was done actually usually during a visit to Israel in order to carry out arms deals and things like that. So we have, in 1976, we had John Vorster from South Africa, who was also a neo-Nazi supporter. And then moving on to recent years, we have obviously Jair Bolsonaro from Brazil, who has even, says that, again, neo-Nazi supporter, appointed a neo-Nazi foreign minister, said that Hitler was actually a good strategist and kind of being apologetic for Hitler. We have Salvini from Lega Nord in Italy in 2019, fascist and homophobe. We have Duterte from the Philippines, 2018, Orban from Hungary, 2018, South Sudan, Kenya, Hernandez from Honduras, Burma, which was accused of genocide, etc., during at that time, 2015, they have visited Yad Vashem, but they've also been visiting Israeli army bases and arms manufacturers. So this is what is happening, and in order to challenge that, we have to negate any and all conflation between Zionism and Judaism, and also point the finger at what matters, point the finger at it not accepting basically the assault on Palestinian rights and the rights of every other group living here in the name of Judaism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, comrades. Sorry, I had to do this. We have two more speakers. Comrades, if you have questions or comments, unfortunately, we don't have time to bring in people from the floor, but please put it on the Q&A, which is at the bottom of your screen. And we're trying to sum them up and put them to the speakers then for when they come back for about 3 minutes. So thank you very much, Ronnie. We are now moving to the US. We're very glad to have Steve Zeltzer with us, who we've come across on some other subjects where we're working together. He's a filmmaker and a working class activist in the USA. And of course, the US government and the secret state is behind very much of this campaign to silence the anti-war movement internationally. And comrades have made reference to the recent visit of Mike Pompeo in Israel and the West Bank. He ordered that all labels coming from all products coming from the occupied West Bank should be labeled as products of Israel. And he is proposing that NGOs like Amnesty International and Oxfam are anti-Semitic and should be treated as anti-Semitic and decriminalized as anti-Semitic. So there's a huge struggle going on in the US as well, as always, very important to our fight back collectively. So welcome, Steve.
Okay, thank you very much for having this, and I'm happy to be here. And it's obviously an international question, the issue of the rights of Palestinians and the rights of people who are critical of Israel and what the apartheid policies of Israel. So this is a very important, and it's also, and we'll get into it, a question of not only just censorship, the question of censorship and the use of social media and communication technology to prevent people from getting issues out that challenge the Zionist state and its history. And of course, this event, the one good thing about the pandemic has been that it's forced people to use international communication media. So we're having this conference today, really an international conference that probably would not have been held without this pandemic. And it's happened as far as the working class movement in the United States using communication technology on an international level, which can be very, very powerful, and it has to expand while we have the chance to use it, because there is a move to censor it. But I wanted to start with the situation of the working class in the United States and the role of Zionism, because the Golda Meir's statue is in the AFL-CIO, the headquarters of the AFL-CIO. And the AFL-CIO, of course, was a pro-capitalist, pro-imperialist organization formed in 1954 to fight communism, so-called communism. But it was formed to as a pro-capitalist and pro-imperialist organization working with the CIA. And its alliance with the Zionist is not an accident. And what is the history of Zionists in the United States? B'nai B'rith, the ADL, for example, in the 1940s was involved in witch hunts against leftists in the United States. The Zionists actively worked with McCarthy and the witch hunters against communists in the unions, against trade unionists. So there's a long history of collaboration of imperialist agents, FBI, with the Zionists against the left. And this is also continued internationally. The issue of terrorism, when I talk about terrorism, as we all, I think, agree, a chief terrorist country in the world is the United States. The United States now has 800 bases around the world. They're bombing people with drones, murdering people, not only citizens of other countries, but American citizens are being murdered by these drones and U.S. Military policy. So what is what does that mean as far as the use of the word terrorism, which I think is very important, terrorist. And actually, the campaign in the United States against terrorism has been used politically now against people who are critical of Israel and professors even. There was a case of Anthony Hall, who was a professor at Lethbridge, Canada, who his website was taken down by the FBI. They're seizing websites around the world. The latest attack that I'm involved in is Rabab Abdul-Hadi, who is a professor at San Francisco State at Ahmed. And actually, Ronnie was going to attend a panel that they were going to have on the issue of liberation of the struggles around the world. And it was canceled by Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube. They canceled this panel. And so the right of free speech, arguing that there were terrorists on this panel. And so we have to look at this international campaign of the Zionists and the imperialists together, and they are connected. We can't separate them. And I think one of the key questions is, what is the working class going to do about this? What is the role of the working class and the trade unions in regard to this? Because in the case of Rabab, her union, California Faculty Association, the San Francisco Labor Council, have supported her against actual threats, terrorist threats, of Zionists who've gone on the campus and put up posters saying she's a terrorist, of students, Palestinian students who've been on Facebook charged with being terrorists. So there's a witch hunt and a terror campaign against Palestinians, against critics of Israel that has gone on in an organized way. And the organized Jewish Community Center in the Bay Area actually was supporting this effort of terrorism. So we have the leadership of the Jewish community, the Zionist Jewish community, actually engaged in a terror campaign against critics of Israel, against Palestinians and other critics of Israel. And that's something we have to take up, because if we're going to transform the situation in the working class and the trade union movement, we have to educate workers about this issue of Zionism. What is Zionism? And what does it mean? Well, Zionism, I think we're all agreed here, is a racist ideology. And Zionism actually, because of that racist ideology, was involved in collaborating with the Nazis. Adolf Eichmann was invited to Israel. It was a project in which the Nazis said, we support Jews leaving Germany and going to Palestine, going to another place. It was a joint effort. So this denialism of actually the Zionist history is important to bring up in the labor movement. Why in the United States? Well, the American labor movement says they are secular. They believe in equality for all workers, equal rights for all. Well, that is not the case, obviously, for Palestinians. Palestinians and non-Jews do not have equal rights in Israel. So we need a political campaign in the labor movement that Israel is an apartheid state, it's a racist state, and it is contrary to a democratic secular trade union movement, a democratic secular labor movement. And we have to take that up politically in the unions. And the other thing that we have to look at in the fight against Zionism and the attack on critics of Zionism is that the key task, I think, of revolutionaries is to mobilize the labor movement against the state of Israel. And in the Bay Area, we did that when we had a mass picket, a boycott of the Zim line in the West Coast. We shut down the Zim line. The ILW supported that action of boycotting it. We need, and this is critical, we need a campaign in the labor movement to boycott Israel, to take action against Israel. And I think the great failure of Jeremy Corbyn is his failure, his refusal to go after Israel and expose the fact that there was a conspiracy or an organized effort to attack him and attack critics of Israel by the Israeli government. And the silence about those, I mean, I think that those are very much connected. Israel is involved in a daily level in the internal affairs of Britain and in the internal affairs of the United States. I mean, they're open about it. They go to the US Congress. They supported Trump. They support the racist and anti-Semites. So this is a reality that we have to bring out, that in fact, Israel is playing a role in organizing this international campaign to get rid of professors, critical professors. The ADL, and I was involved in it, we were exposing the role of the ADL, B'nai B'rith, in attacking professors. They had a blacklist of 500 professors, not only critics of Israel, but anti-apartheid activists. They're actually spying on anti-apartheid activists as well, who were critical of Israel. So this connection, I think, and this is another issue that we have to bring up, and that is that the Israeli regime was a supporter of apartheid Israel. The Histadrut, the trade union federation, was investing in South Africa. And today in the Black community, Blacks have been attacked by the Zionists for the campaign for equality of the Blacks. So the Zionists play a political role, and also they play a role inside the trade unions. Now, the SEIU and the AFL-CIO, those who have fought against repression of the Palestinians and fought against the Israelis, have been thwarted by the leadership of the AFL-CIO. John Sweeney, the former president of the AFL-CIO, stopped resolutions from coming up in the SEIU with the argument that the Jewish Labor Committee, which is a Zionist committee inside the unions, had they had to get approval before you could get a resolution on the issue of Israel presented. And resolutions were withdrawn because of the Jewish Labor Committee set up inside the unions. So this issue politically of how we're fighting in the unions is critical for workers to understand this, because this is all undercover. Most workers are completely unaware of these issues. Now, the other thing is I want to talk about the issue of the Facebook, YouTube, and Zoom, because the use of these tools are critical for us to understand. Facebook hired Israeli officials to be in charge of sanitizing Facebook. So Palestinian journalists and others have had their sites taken down. There's a organized censorship and sanitizing social media of criticism of Israel. And we have to be aware of that, not only that, but we have to take up a political campaign, because the effort to censor the social media and the internet is absolutely a threat to democratic rights on a global level. And we have to fight that politically, I think, to understand that, you know, for workers to take that up and in the labor movement, the unions. And I think that issue can connect to the role of the governments, the imperialist governments, who are aligning with Israel and suppressing criticism of Israel. And that is very important, because it's the attack on the critics of Zionism in the Labor Party is expected, and they want to shut it down. Why do they want to shut it down? Because they're afraid that there's going to be action taken against Israel by the working class in Britain. They're afraid that workers will take action. And that's, I think, what we have to take up. It cannot simply be a defense of critics of Zionism. We have to take up a campaign for direct labor action, international labor action against Israel, to shut Israel down, to isolate Israel, as South Africa was isolated. Now, the last point I want to leave is the role of the unions in the fight against apartheid Israel, because in the UAW, the graduate students here of California passed a resolution supporting the boycott of Israel. And the UAW leadership ruled that out of order, even though there had been a democratic debate and discussion on that. They ruled that out of order. They said because it would affect UAW members who were making in companies who were doing trade with Israel, economic trade with Israel. Now that argument is interesting, because during the anti-apartheid struggle, the UAW actually supported a boycott of South Africa. But in the case of Israel, there was no such position. So I think we have to conduct a political education campaign. We have to conduct a education campaign and a labor movement for direct action and solidarity with the Palestinians, labor action and solidarity, and take on the trade union bureaucracy of the unions, who actually are, in most cases, are supporting the a defense of Israel and against direct action by workers around the world to isolate and to prevent Israel from conducting its policies.
Thank you very much, Steve. Very interesting. It's hugely important, of course, what's going on in the US, and you've given us a really, really good overview. And of course, they, like with everything else, they take it that bit further, don't they? They're not just anti-Semites, they're terrorists, labeled terrorists, but it won't be too long before it comes here, I'm sure. Okay, our last platform speaker, we're very pleased to welcome, because the comrades have made reference to independent Jewish voices in Canada, because they've put this really good article out, pulling together how many organizations and individuals internationally are not falling for that fake definition of anti-Semitism. And it's really important, if we want to, fight back internationally, that we understand we are not alone, and why meetings like these are so important. So we're very pleased to welcome Rowan Gaudet, I think it's French, to speak about the No IHRA campaign that the organization has put together. Welcome, comrade.
Thank you. Yes, my name is Rowan. I'm part of Independent Jewish Voices Canada. So I'm going to be speaking about what we've been doing here in Canada, what's happening here, and the work that we've been doing, because there's a few things that we've been doing to fight, and we've actually had quite a few successes. And one of the things that's been really important, as many people have said, are these kinds of international conversations. So I'm very thankful to be here and thankful for all the people who've already spoken. So I'll begin. Independent Jewish Voices might sound familiar to a lot of you in the UK. We borrowed with permission the name from a UK group, but here in Canada, we're 12 years old. We're a Jewish group that works in solidarity with Palestine. We're the only pro-BDS Jewish group in Canada, as well as other things. And in 2019, we launched our No IHRA campaign, which has seen a lot of campaigning and research put in. But what has actually happened in Canada was, first, in early 2019, the federal government adopted the IHRA as policy, not as legislation, but as policy. And this then led to a similar step that has happened in the UK and the US, where after being adopted at the federal level, it then starts to be brought down to more local levels, where they try to put it forward in more enforceable ways. And so what happened here was they started bringing it to city councils, specifically in Montreal and Vancouver, which are two of the three largest cities in Canada, as well as Calgary, one of the other cities. And in all three, we had local mobilizations by IJV activists that managed to confront and shut down the attempts to pass IHRA. And in all three cities, the IHRA was rejected or postponed indefinitely. And so we've seen success on that level. And then they started going even more local into like municipalities that are a part of cities, or more regional and rural areas. And so it has started to be passed a little bit there. And it's also been adopted by several student unions. And it's been seen use here against professors and against speakers, as well as in, I believe, a junior high school, where it was recently used in Ontario. And the kind of big thing that has happened in the last several months was in Ontario, which is the province in Canada with the largest population. The government there, which is a right-wing government under Premier Ford, sent Bill 168, which was meant to adopt the IHRA as legislation. And what we did there was we actually took things a step further than our local mobilizations that we'd done in the cities, and we started forming a broad coalition with other groups. And so we formed a diverse coalition that included Palestinian Youth Movement, who have been central in this struggle, Canadian Arab Institute, labor and faculty unions, which I'm happy to see here today, as well as civil liberties organizations and the Canadian Federation of Students. And all these groups together in a coalition sought to resist Bill 168. And so when things went to the committee that was meant to discuss it, there was over 100 submissions of groups trying to speak or trying to send written submissions to oppose the IHRA to the Ontario government. And the Ontario government, which again is a right-wing government, was forced to take back channels to adopt it. And instead of putting it through Parliament in actual legislation, they did it through an order in council, which gave it less legal teeth and was also much less democratic and much less visible. And this was directly because of this diverse coalition and the fact that we had spoken to Muslim allies and that we had spoken to labor allies, etc. And we were actually able to get a semi-victory in this, which is of course huge when we're seeing what's happening in other places in the world. And so what's some of the work that we've done that we've put into this, and this is all available on our No IHRA website, which I can post the link to in a moment. We've run polls of Canadian opinion, public opinion in multiple years, which I'm not going to regale you with statistics, but has come up with such things as 48% of Canadian Jews agree with the statement, quote, accusations of anti-Semitism are often used to silence legitimate criticism of Israeli government policies, end quote. And so we can give that statistic that 48% of Canadian Jews believe that. We've also been lobbying university presidents, political parties, student unions, counselors, etc. We've created a video which highlights the main issues and is meant to be something that's a bit more engaging than a lot of the more textual analysis that's been put out, which is still, of course, important, but we wanted something that's a bit more engaging while still maintaining that high level of analysis. We've also created our own definition, and it's been brought up, you know, do we really need a definition of anti-Semitism? And while I think that's a useful discussion, it's also useful to be able to say, well, you know, the IHRA is a flawed document. As has been brought up, it's bad at fighting anti-Semitism. We actually have our own better definition. So if you really want one, if you really feel it's necessary, use this one that we can explain to you why it's better. And that includes such reasons as the fact that we say anti-Semitism is a form of hatred towards Jews because they are Jews, which is not mentioned in the IHRA document and allows for that kind of broad and sweeping attacks and accusations. We also link it to other forms of racial hatred, which of course is instrumental instead of this kind of isolationist standpoint that the IHRA pushes. And we've also done a full report which tackles line by line the IHRA definition and really just decimates it and points out all the flaws within the document just as a document, never mind in how it's used. And we've also done a tracker, which I was the lead on, which lists different instances around the world of where the IHRA has been weaponized. And so we list 35 different instances with citations and a paragraph explaining them all in 6 different countries where the IHRA has been weaponized to silence critics of Israel. And that's in Canada, the US, the UK, Germany, as well as instances in Spain and Italy, which took place in September. And so this document really shows, you know, the claim that the IHRA is just meant, like, doesn't actually affect speech on Palestine is totally false. And we can show that on an international scale, and we can show the connections there. More on the local level, we also have a compendium of 30 examples in Canada where pro-Israel groups have tried to silence forums and speakers critical of Israel. We also recently put together 11 examples of how Israel is a racist state as a kind of, you know, lashback at the 11 examples in the IHRA definition. And this is part of an effort to really center Israeli racism, this is racism of the Israeli state in our discussions and make sure that that's not forgotten to kind of left to the side when we get into discussions of anti-Semitism, et cetera, with the IHRA definition. And we've also played a role in the work that's being put together Jewish groups on an international scale that was mentioned by Leah earlier. And so this is some of the work that we've been doing. And what we've been finding is that our perspective has come down in all this experience that there are several key points that need to be made. A first and a simple one that's been made by many people here is that the IHRA is terrible at fighting real anti-Semitism. It is not useful for that purpose. It is not helpful. It's a distraction. And that point could be made in a bunch of different ways. We've also taken the position that it's not just a matter of opposing the adoption of the anti-Semitism, because what we've been seeing here as well as in the US was people have been describing a game of whack-a-mole where they're trying to keep track of everywhere that it's adopted. And what was necessary was a shift towards offensive, towards defying the IHRA and loudly declaring, you know, Israel's a racist state. In saying this, I'm opposing the IHRA because the IHRA is a flawed document. And so that loud defiance has been something that is crucial and that we've been taking upon ourselves as a Jewish group to put ourselves at the forefront of that and allow our allies to do the same. And at the heart of the IHRA, the kind of core of the issue is Palestine and the Palestinian struggle. And that's something that needs to be kept. IHRA is, of course, a response to BDS and the successes of the BDS movement, among other things. And so maintaining the focus on Israeli oppression and on the Palestinian struggle is crucial. And what we've also found, especially in the work in Ontario, where we created this coalition, was that placing the lived experiences of Palestinians heart and center of our arguments and amplifying their voices, posits and makes totally clear the absurdity of the IHRA definition, because claiming that saying Israel is a racist state is anti-Semitic and putting that alongside statements of the lived realities of Palestinians shows how ridiculous the IHRA definition is. And so this really comes down to the point that, like, what is central here in the IHRA is that we keep it as part of a longer struggle, and that we keep it as part of a broader struggle for Palestinian justice. Because what we were finding at the beginning was that we were getting very caught up in the IHRA and becoming very focused on the IHRA. And we started having more success when we kept the longer struggle. And then we started seeing the IHRA as a part of that broader struggle. And when we highlight the contradictions of the IHRA, we can also use that moment to highlight the contradictions of the defenders of apartheid who are using the IHRA definition to mask their positions and to hide the immorality of the stances they're taking. And so in that sense, the IHRA is best seen both in strategy and in how it's presented as part of this broader struggle and as part of this longer struggle for the liberation and for justice for Palestine and Palestinians. Thank you.
Really very interesting. Thank you so much, Rowan. This is fascinating work you've guys been doing. I think we actually have to spend a little bit of time investigating your website further. This is really important work you guys have been doing. So I'm really glad we got you along and can learn from each other in this. Yes, it's the question here is, of course, the overcoming fear and silence and fighting back against the IHRA. I think you guys probably haven't quite the level of personalized attacks that we've been experiencing here in terms of, suspending and, being vilified in the international press. It's been quite traumatic for a lot of comrades, but this is fantastic work we've been doing. Our comrade Jackie Walker is now summing up a few questions that have come in, and I know we're overrunning. Sorry, comrades. I can't stop comrades when they're making really useful speeches and contributions. It's been such a good meeting. So I hope that comrades can then 2 or 3 minutes sum up from the discussion. So
can I just add, because this is to do with International Jewish Voices in Canada, and I've put this in the chat. Next Sunday, I am doing a session with them where I'm performing parts of the lynching, and I've got a well-known Canadian Jewish dramatist who is going to be interviewing me about the situation in the UK. So if you're interested in, again, repeating this really beneficial, more internationalist view of what's going on, there will be a bit of discussion, obviously, of course. Can I suggest you have a look at that? It's also on my Facebook and on my Twitter. It's next Sunday at 8 o'clock, and I think it's going to be really something special. But anyway, good to see you, Rowan, actually. I'm feeling very good about our contact. Questions that are coming in. How do we combat the loss of our platforms in terms of, this is about the alternative left media, in particular with algorithms? Isn't this sort of witch hunt, this is another question, isn't this witch hunt a way of silencing criticism of US foreign policy? Somebody wants to know from Ronnie, what is the state, and I think a lot of us want to know this, what is the state of Jewish resistance in Israel? A number of questions came in on what is the charity Liberty doing? Well, some of us know the answer to that, but I think it would be good to talk about that. And then a question to Rowan directly about the IJV, which is, are you working with Palestine Legal in the US? Those were the questions.
Thank you very much, comrades. I'm going to take comrades in the order because I'm getting confused otherwise that how they spoke earlier on. So, Tony, would you like to have 3 minutes, please?
Well, this has been an extremely useful and interesting conference on the IHRA, and we've heard a number of different perspectives. But I think of one thing we can agree with: the IHRA is not about combating anti-Semitism. It's about redefining anti-Semitism not as hostility or hatred of Jews, but as criticism and hatred of the racism of Israel. And when the IHRA says that it's anti-Semitic to call Israel a racist state, then I think we need to deconstruct that somewhat. And the question I would throw out and pose is this: if Jews in Britain or in Canada or the United States or wherever, if they experience the same treatment as Palestinians, would they not say that that was anti-Semitic? If they even experienced a tenth of what the Palestinians experienced, just imagine that a group of Christians came to Golders Green in London and said that these houses belonged to our ancestors who lived here 2,000 years ago. We are reclaiming them in the name of the Anglo-Saxons. Would that be anti-Semitic? Or would that be self-determination for the Christian population of Britain? I mean, I think the answer is obvious. Or to give another example, I mean, the Jewish National Fund owns and controls 93% of the land in Israel, to which Palestinian Israelis do not have access. That is citizens of the Israeli state, although it's a very degraded citizenship. Imagine if there was a Christian National Fund in Britain, which owns a similar proportion of the lands in this country. And if I or Jackie or anyone who was Jewish, we wanted to rent or to buy that land, and they told us, no, you're not Christian. We don't rent to people who are Jewish. Would that be anti-Semitic? I mean, the answer is obviously yes, it would be. So I think we need to understand what the IHRA is. It's a political instrument in order to defend, and it was devised in order to defend Israel from the accusations that it was a racist state, it was a state of ethnic cleansing, it was a state of Jewish racial supremacy. And if we understand the IHRA as that, then I think we can deal with it. And the fact of the matter is, of course, that Keir Starmer and those in charge of the Labour Party in Britain are not in the least concerned about racism. I mean, we know for Keir Starmer that Black Lives Matter was a moment in history which has gone. We know that for Tom Watson and the Labour right, who were so concerned about anti-Semitism, they could not even be bothered in 2014 to vote against the 2014 Immigration Act, which introduced a hostile environment into Britain. So their record when it comes to fighting racism and opposing racism is nugatory, to say the least. This is not about racism against Jewish people. And we also have to be quite clear. 50, 70, 80 years ago, the majority of Jewish people lived in the Jewish East End of London. They were working class. They supported the left. Half of the votes for the only communist MP ever to be elected as a communist in England, Philip Heraton, came from Jewish voters in the Mile End constituency. Today, you probably wouldn't get a fraction of that supporting anything to the left. In Golders Green, Hendon, Edgware, etc., where Jewish people live. So the Jewish population of Britain has changed, and it's changed so as its identity has changed. And that is really what this is about. If Jewish people were really experiencing anti-Semitism, if they experienced what Black people face, if it was an offence to drive while Jewish, if Jews suffered economic persecution, if they were subject to regular attacks by racists, police violence, disproportionate imprisonment, and all the rest of it, then the ruling class would not want to know. Keir Starmer certainly would not want to know. So we have to be clear. This is not about anti-Semitism. And my final point really is Liberty, 2 years ago, did adopt a position against the views of its officers and executive, against the IHRA. It has done absolutely bugger all about that. in contrast to the American Civil Liberties Union, which has been quite active against the IHRA and the suppression of free speech. So I think we actually do need to, one of our tasks is to put pressure on Liberty to live up to its own proclaimed intentions and its own avowed principles, namely it defends freedom, because at the moment, Liberty is not defending civil liberties in Britain. So thank you very much for coming to this rally.
Thank you, Tony. Okay, Kevin, please, 3 minutes if you can.
Okay. Thank you. I'd like to thank the other comrades and the other speakers, both for the questions and for their remarks, which I've learned a lot this afternoon. I'd like to just take up one question that John Hall asked me in particular about whether students and indeed others in the universities could take up the specific points in the definition and challenge the university to, in a sense, justify it. And I think that that type of challenge is an important one. And the speakers from Canada and from the United States and elsewhere have shown some ways of campaigning and so on that we could adopt. However, what I was very keen to stress in my remarks about the universities and the definition is really this idea that the climate of fear that is, that the definition engenders has now become, I think, quite widespread. So we have to challenge that, not just on the specifics of the definition, but also on the broader point about the freedom of discussion and perhaps the wider political agenda of the people who've taken up this definition. As Tony and other speakers have pointed out, many people who use this definition come from the right, some of them indeed from the far right, and they're not noted for their real commitment to anti-racism. If anything, they're noted as anti-Semitic. So I think our campaign in the union and our campaign in wider society is to argue for the opening up of debate, for allowing the right to challenge, to defend those rights, and the identification of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, and indeed placing that whole type of politics beyond the pale. That's really the target we have to go for. So this is the proximate cause, but there's a much wider issue here. And I think we've seen that in Mike Pompeo's attempt to link all sorts of anti-imperialist politics to anti-Semitism. And above all, the Labour right and the British Conservatives have attempted to do the same thing. So this is not just a defence of our politics, it's a defence of free speech and indeed the defence of the right to criticise and indeed confront the status quo. So we begin with this definition, but we also go for what lies behind the definition. The wider geopolitics that Tony and others have talked about are obviously very important, but it's how it's being used in Britain and indeed other countries to close down debate and to close down any criticism from the left. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Thank you. Leah, please, for 3 minutes. Sorry, you're still muted somehow, although you look unmuted, but it's... Try again. No, can't hear you.
No, it's because I forgot to bring my
that's it.
my Madonna. Anyway, fine. I think I can be less because a lot of the points I would have responded to, Tony has covered. In terms of the specific questions, I wish I knew about algorithms, and I hope we get somebody in our movement who does understand how we might be able to operate against. I mean, they've been used so disgracefully, these algorithms, so that we sort of we're forced to operate or pushed to operate in our own little bubbles. What I really wanted to say is there's a climate of fear. That's what Kevin called it, and yeah, I understand that there's risks, but when we think about the rise of the right, when we think about what's happened in the past and what's happening in other countries, the risks to us are pretty small for speaking out. We're not going to get incarcerated for our points of view. We're not going to be subject to state torture or murder. we're not, as heroes, that we are privileged to stand on the shoulders of and to be speaking on platforms with, like Ronnie Kasrils, having to take up arms against vile repression and oppression and murder. We are not in the resistance against the Nazis when they were in power. We're not in the Spanish Civil War, and we could all go on with many more examples. That doesn't mean we have no right to be worried and frightened, and there's a real impact on our well-being, our mental health, and so on. And many of us will experience being ostracized from our own families and people who we thought were allies and so on. But really, comrades, as Rabbi Hillel, I think it was the elder, said, I'm sure Tony will correct me, as the son of a rabbi, he said, if not now, then when? So let's just work together. It's been so great to be on this platform with so many wonderful people. And Rowan, I can say I'm glad to be part of the international group working that I think was started by IJP Canada, and to be working with some of your activists on developing an international response against the IHRA, and hopefully finding other ways to work together. I will shut up there because everyone else gets a chance to talk. Thank you so much for having me here. Thank you. Lots to think about. Thank you.
For sure. If we don't fight back now, when will we? Quite right. This is relatively harmless, what's happening at the moment to us in Britain, at least. So Sami, please, we have 3 minutes.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, we can. Hi.
Okay. Thanks, Tina. The question I wanted to address was raised by Jackie about this anti-Semitism campaign against the left is partly to do with silencing critics of US foreign policy. And I think that is very, very true, because the United States is using Israel as a forward base, strategic base in the region. Israel has an international importance, not only Middle Eastern importance, to US policies. I think it's a total myth, and probably an anti-Semitic myth, to say that Israel controls the United States or Israel controls US foreign policy. Every single fact and strategically important political event in the Middle East pointed to how the United States is the dominant power, how the United States uses Israel more and more over the decades. Until today, it has become indistinguishable from US foreign policy. Israel used as a forward base for US imperialism in its expansionist policy in the Middle East, and its espionage activities, military activities. Day after day, they show why Israel is so important to US foreign policy in the region. So criticizing Israel, exposing its racist nature, exposing its wars of aggression, directly impinges on criticisms of US foreign policy in general, worldwide. So if we talk about a new Cold War against China, we are also talking about using Israel as part of that umbrella of foreign policies in the region. If they want to destroy Syria, then Israel is important. If they want to destroy Iraq, then Israel is important. If they want to destroy and reoccupy Lebanon, then Israel is important. So we are now talking about an extremely sensitive issue to do with US foreign policy. So if we criticize our own British government here for being such a poodle of US foreign policy, we have to also talk about our own support for the Saudi regime's war against the Yemeni people, about our own foreign policy of backing Israel and keeping silent about its crimes in the West Bank and in Gaza and against the Palestinian people in general, or it's daily, really daily, I'm not exaggerating, violations of Lebanese sovereignty, of their attacks on the Syrian people and on Iraqi people. Several raids were carried out by Israeli Air Force against Iraqi targets in the last year or so. So we're talking about an integral part of US foreign policy and British foreign policy. So when we are criticizing Israel, we're touching on sensitive areas of US and British foreign policy, and they would like to include that in their definition of anti-Semitism. How odious, how hypocritical. That's why we have to fight back. One of the reasons we need to fight back, because fighting this smear is also part of our work against wars of aggression and exposing US and British foreign policy of war and aggression. Thank you, Tina.
Thank you very much, comrade. Quite rightly, I think you're putting the fight against the imperialism is at the heart of what we're going through at the moment. Okay, Ronnie Kasrils, please.
Thanks. Well, struggles for change, call it revolutionary struggles, call it struggles for progress, go through phases. They in the ascent at times, at other times they repress. This is the nature in history. And from your angle in Britain at the moment, and one can understand it, it looks really bleak. I mean, it's so astonishing what's been happening in the Labour Party. It's almost unbelievable that it's come to pass in this way. Whether Labour can ever reconstitute itself, I really, talking from Johannesburg, can Starmer actually bring about any success for Labour with the electorate after what's happened? So it's very dismal, it's bleak. This particular phase, it's very bleak for the Palestinians, given the treacherous normalization process taking place there. At the other hand, we've just come through the most amazing upheaval and challenge to racism, white supremacy, through the United States upheaval with Black Lives Matter, which has affected the whole world. Imperialism is rotten with its contradictions, and it fights back. And your role there, Leah, don't undermine the fact. I remember having this discussion when I first arrived in Britain in exile in the 60s, that you have a struggle on your hands. It's very important. And to stand and fight against this witch hunt is crucial to the way you can inspire others, because we all have to find this way of linking hands across the world. This is the response. I really like Rowan in Canada's point, and it's important to emphasize and re-emphasize, given that there are so many struggles taking place throughout the world, that central is the Palestinian issue. He put it very well. I'm not going to repeat it, but just to say why I felt in coming here to join you in this wonderful event of solidarity, to bring to the fore the statement of the Palestinian and Arab prominent figures who made their declaration against anti-Semitism. I know there's a question too, it's the other Ronnie Barkan, about Israeli Jews and their mobilization. It's very small there. But in South Africa, the white guys like Joe Slovo, Ruth First, myself, a younger guy, we were a few hundred, similar to what's happening with Jewish people within Israel, and reinforced by Jews around the world, which is very important. Much more important, though, is everybody, not just looking at it as a Jewish issue, but the white grouping in South Africa, this minority. We stood our ground and called the lie of the mythology of white supremacy, which is why when we look in the United States, the way young white youth came out into the streets and joined with African Americans, it was so powerful, and it's radiated in Britain through Europe and elsewhere, we are yet to hear from the Arab street, the Arab working masses and the unemployed. They speak over and over. The contradictions there are immense. And I would say, comrades, you're fighting the good fight against Starmer and against the British elite and all those phonies and hypocrites. You will be, we all will be energized by the Palestinian resistance and Arab resistance against those rotten feudal monarchs, as we're being infused by inspiration everywhere. And the point that our comrade from the United States made about bringing out the working masses and finding ways to talk to the labor class, as you've always tried to do in Britain, and it's difficult. We must never give up on that. So my feelings, as Gramsci would say, yes, the optimism of the spirit, comrades, is very important. And Fidel Castro made that point. We live in an age where it's an absolute duty to uphold an optimistic spirit. And I'm not saying it as an article of faith. I'm saying it because there are people like us, and behind all of you, you're talking for incalculable masses throughout this world. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Ronnie. This is really inspiring and hard.
I'm just an old rabble rouser. You youngsters carry on with the struggle. But
So
we're here with you. We're with you.
We have to do it together.
Absolutely, young and old.
The other Ronnie, please. 3 minutes. Ronnie Barkan.
Yes, unmute. Anti-Semitism is abhorrent, like all forms of racism and supremacy, including Zionism. So I could tell you about how I'm being censored and so on, and how the struggle for free speech is extremely important. I was taken to court for challenging Israeli criminal and apartheid representative. I was literally gagged by German police for speaking up against Israeli crimes, routinely censored on social media, etc. But it wouldn't be enough just to focus on that, on the fact that we do have to demand our rights, for freedom of speech, etc., freedom of expression, because the challenges ahead are bigger than that. Okay, and the challenges ahead we really have to tackle them head on. So when I say that we have to challenge Zionism just like we challenge anti-Semitism, okay, and we have to reject it in its totality. I mean it literally. And I was asked both about the struggle of within Palestine. By the way, I moved from Palestine, also known as Israel, to Berlin, because I see Germany as the last standing bastion for Zionism. I moved there exactly because I wish to challenge the Zionist system, etc. And this is where I think that challenging that system is most needed. What is happening here? I'm currently in Palestine. What is happening here? There are those who demonstrate and with very clear stance against Zionist crimes, etc. At the same time, there is the whole liberal Zionist discourse, and we don't have time to go into it. I alluded to it, but I was asked about that also in the questions, and I gave an answer in writing about these ongoing demonstrations against Netanyahu, the anti-Netanyahu demonstrations, corruptions, etc. I am absolutely opposed to these demonstrations. I think they are part of the problem. First of all, they're called the flag demonstrations, and these people are very proud of their Zionist rags. Some of them are holding pink Zionist rags instead of blue and white ones, so they are a little more liberal. But just as much they are supportive, they are against the corruption and criminality of Netanyahu, but at the same time they are holding dear to the deep-rooted supremacy of that Zionist state and that criminality and that embedded corruption of that system. So we have to not only challenge it, now we have to challenge the entire system. We have to not only challenge freedom of expression, we have to challenge the entire system that negates our freedom to express ourselves. And obviously, those who we're not only struggling for ourselves, we're struggling for everyone. And on that note, I think that it is really, how should I say it? We don't have enough time to go into it. On that note, I think that we just have to push forward, exactly like the other Ronnie said. There are so many things happening in the world. There is the globalizing of, let's say, the evil powers, you know, globalizing of fascism and racism, etc. And we have an opportunity to also globalize the struggle against it. And the BDS campaign is key in that, because it is basically based on these on this human rights discourse, on these fundamental rights for Palestinians, equality, freedom, and justice. And this can be applied not only for Palestinians, but globally. And I think that when we demand these rights, we move away from that discourse that is trying to silence us or to sway the attention, the focus into other areas, and challenge what really matters. Demanding the rights and opposing those systems globally and locally that deny these rights.
Thank you very much, Ronnie. I'm sorry, I have to wind comrades up. I could listen to all of you for hours, but we are very short. So Steve, could you please sum up for 3 minutes?
Okay, well, I think that we live in a historic period of crisis of imperialism, inter-imperialist rivalry, and the rise of fascism. And I think that when 74 million people voted for Donald Trump, that's something we have to be concerned about. And there is a rise of fascism in the United States. And the Democrats contribute to that because they have no solution for the working class, their program. And the Democrats are Zionist, the leadership of the Democratic Party. Kamala Harris, hardcore, Biden. They support the Zionist state. They support the oppression of Palestinians. They give money to the oppression of Palestinians every day, every minute. So I think that for us in the United States, for myself and others, the necessity of building a workers' party, a democratic mass workers' party, is critical. It has a program, an international program for the defense of the Palestinians, but also a program for the American working class. And I think what we, in this discussion today internationally, what we have to do is build an international campaign in the working class for the defense of the Palestinians and against the fascist and the right wing and the imperialist policies. That's critical. And I think that again, the great fear of the Zionists is that the working class will take action against Israel. One of the interesting things is when we shut down the Zim shipping line on the West Coast, the ILWU did that, there was actually silence on the part of the Zionist media about this action. They didn't want people to know that the workers in the United States had taken political action against Israel because they were fearful of spreading. And in South Africa, there's a large amount of trade with Israel. Many countries do trade with Israel. That has to be shut down. So I think we have to, from my perspective, direct international working class action is the way to support the Palestinian people, the Palestinian workers, and building direct links with Palestinian workers, with workers in the United States who have the same issues and same struggles. So I think that is, but I do think, and it's come out here in this discussion, the ideology and the history of Zionism is important. You cannot fight the attack on anti-Zionists or critics of Israel in Britain without talking about the real history of Zionism. You can't do it. Great. So we have to really go out front and say the Zionists were collaborating with the Nazis. They were working with the Nazis. That's who they are. The Zionists in the United States work with the fascists. They work with the right wing in the United States. They work with anti-Semites. Are these people supporting the Jewish people by working with Nazis? Is that helping the Jewish people? Absolutely not. They do it because of their political ideology and their agenda of racism and an apartheid regime. And I think that this is what we have to raise concretely. And the failure of Jeremy Corbyn to actually challenge the Zionists, challenge Israel and what they were doing, confused people. And that's why we who want to fight Zionism, who want to solidarize with the Palestinian workers, have to bring up this history, and we have to bring it up in the working class so workers understand. How can you say you're supporting equal rights for all workers, including blacks, but you're allowing the suppression of Palestinians? That's a contradiction. So I think we have to take up this history. We have to take up this international campaign. We have to have more discussions like this. And we have to build up a political education campaign using these communication tools which allow us to do that.
Thank you very much, comrade. Very good. Okay, last person to sum up now is Rowan.
I'll be quick, I promise. To briefly answer the question that was posed to me, we actually haven't, to the best of my knowledge, had a chance to work directly with Palestine Legal, but their work was really crucial for the research I did on how the IHRA has been weaponized. So they're doing incredible work, even if we haven't had a chance to directly collaborate with them. One thing that I think is worth mentioning from that research that I did on how IHRA has been weaponized internationally is that, in a certain sense, the Labour Party is kind of exceptional in that outside of the Labour Party, the IHRA has been above and beyond used to target Muslims, Arabs, especially Palestinians in the diaspora. And that's not to say that it hasn't been used in the same way in the Labour Party, but the overall, I mean, there's no statistics, but the overall kind of layout, the map of who's being targeted outside of the Labour Party is really highlighting people who are Muslim and people who are Palestinian. And so the Labour Party in that sense is exceptional. And Tina mentioned that, you know, the vitriol faced in the UK is at another level, and it truly is. And so when I say that, you know, we've committed to opposing the IHRA and defying the IHRA, I do want to conclude with the note that, you know, seeing what has happened in the UK and seeing the people who, despite all of it, have stood up in resistance, many of whom are here today and have been inspiring, have been an inspiration for us. So thank you all for what you've done and for this talk.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, comrade. This has been, Sami just posted in the chat, this has been the most inspirational Zoom meeting he's been to. It's been the most inspirational meeting I've been to without Zoom. So thank you very much, comrades. It's been a long day, but it's been so worthwhile. It really has. And we have learned, I think, from every single person who's been speaking, and we will edit all this up into smaller chunks perhaps as well, so that comrades can re-watch it again. And thank you very much. And I have to say, this is the beginning of something. We have to be very clear about this. This is a long-term campaign that we're facing against us. So we have to really get together internationally to fight back against it internationally. And this has been a really useful start to launch such a campaign. As I said, we're on the 23rd of January. We want to launch hold a conference, a working conference, to actually discuss a charter for free speech. And perhaps this should also discuss what the comrades in Canada have been working on, the definition of anti-Semitism as a workable definition of anti-Semitism might be very well worthwhile for us to get our teeth into. So I'm hoping very much that comrades and other organizations get on board of such a campaign properly, and JVL hopefully Stop the War Coalition as broad a campaign as we can muster, because this is a campaign against all of us on the left, and we all have to fight back. Thank you very much, comrades. You can switch on your microphones if you want, and can all talk now. Thank you for joining us online.
Thank you. Thank you, Tina. That was wonderful. Thank you.
Very good meeting. See you soon, comrades.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you for having me.
Solidarity.
Solidarity.